Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to today's lecture. Now, if you remember, in our last lecture, we concluded our discussion on the long-run theory of production. We earlier discussed the short-run theory of production, and then in our last lecture, we concluded discussion on the long-run theory of production. Towards the end of the lecture, we started a discussion on costs, and we saw how economists thought about costs, and we tried to develop a few concepts about sunk costs, opportunity costs, implicit costs, and explicit costs. Today, we will build on these concepts a little bit further and develop concepts relating to variable costs and fixed costs. Now, all the discussion on costs that we have had so far has been in the context of variable costs. We have not yet talked about fixed costs in any of these lectures. What are variable costs to start with? Let's define them, and that will automatically help you understand the concept of fixed costs. Now, variable costs are all the costs that vary, that is, they change with the level of activity or the level of production or activity. So, if you are producing 50 units of output, you will incur a certain level of costs. If you produce 100 units of output, you will incur another level of costs. Labor costs are an example of variable costs. Electricity costs might be an example of variable costs as well. As you use more machines, more electricity is consumed, and that leads to a higher electricity or power bill, and that's a variable cost. What is a fixed cost? A fixed cost is something which does not change with the level of activity, at least in a short period of time. So if you are considering the term of, let's say, a week or a month or even a year for a company or a firm, then you need to look at some of those costs which do not change or do not vary over that term. Let me give you a couple of examples. Think about the rent for a building or a plant. If the plant or the building has been set up on hired land, that is on land which has been rented from somebody, and that is you are paying rent on that building or on that plant, then that rental payment that is made annually or monthly is considered a fixed cost. Whether you produce 10 units in the plant or 100 units or 200 units, it makes no difference to the rental payment that you have to make. That payment is decided at the start of the year, and you have to make that payment no matter what. Let me give you another example. Think of a foreman, चौकीदार, जो कि किसी भी फैक्ट्री के बाहर चौकीदार की चौकीदारी के फराइज अंजाम देते हैं, हिफाजत करते हैं फैक्ट्री की या गोदाम की. Now, even if the factory is not producing anything, you will probably still need the chowkidar, that foreman. You can't fire him because you still need to safeguard the plant and machinery that is inside the factory. Even if the factory is not producing anything, you will still have to pay that foreman his salary, monthly salary, whether it is 3,000 or 5,000 rupees or whatever, right? So this is another example of fixed cost. Let me give you a third example, and this will make the distinction between variable and fixed costs very clear. Think of a car. You buy a car, and then that car lies in your garage. Now, if you use the car more and more, then the car's engine, its pistons, its plugs, its other components will get used more and more. And therefore, the car will lose value. That is, it will depreciate in value. The parts, the components will need to be replaced after some time. Now, this loss in value that arises because of excessive or usage of the car is a variable cost, right? So, the depreciation in the value of the car that arises because of using it is a variable cost. But you also know that the value of cars becomes less and less with the age of the car. So as a car becomes older, irrespective of the fact that whether it is used or not used, just because the model becomes older and older, the market value of the car becomes less and less. Therefore, the depreciation or the lessening in the value of the car that happens due to mere aging of the car, the mere fact that the car has been bought like 10 years ago, is an example of a fixed cost. That is, whether you use the car or do not use the car will lose its value each year because the model is getting older and older. So this is the distinction between variable and fixed costs. Now, once we've introduced these concepts of fixed and variable costs, you should immediately start to think in terms of long run and short run as to whether it is possible to have fixed costs in the long run. Think about it. Fixed costs are incurred when some factor, underlying factor, is fixed. So for example, if you own a building, then the rent on that building will be fixed, right? But if in the long run you can buy 2 or 3 buildings or 4 buildings or sell off your buildings, then the rental cost of your buildings can also vary. So yes, in the long run, there are no fixed costs. But this distinction is extremely important in the short run. And believe it or not, whether the short run is a week or 6 months or a year, the distinction between variable and fixed costs is critically important for any firm. And because the level or the degree of what determines whether a firm is operating in the short run or the long run varies, some firms might have 3 years as their short run. Other firms might have 10 years as their short run. So sometimes it becomes very difficult to ascertain as to whether a particular cost is fixed or variable. Now another relationship which is very important for you to understand at this introductory stage of our discussion of costs is the relationship between costs and productivity. Now we've been talking about costs and productivity in different contexts, as the productivity or the marginal physical product of capital increases or decreases. And then we've talked about when costs can increase as we hire more and more of a particular factor or use more and more of labor or capital, then the cost of capital and labor increases. But there is a relationship between the two as well. Let me illustrate this through the use of a simple example. Think of a person who manufactures or builds wooden bicycles as toy bicycles for children, right? Small toy bicycles for children. And let's assume that the person's wage rate, so there is a firm who hires this person, it's a one labor firm. The person it charges rupees 300 per day as his salary or wage rate, right? And initially, let's assume that he produces one toy bicycle every day. So what would be the cost of producing the bicycle? Let's assume there is no cost of wood or there is no other cost like electricity or anything else. It's just the cost of the laborer. He charges rupees 300 per day and produces one bicycle per day. What would be the cost of the bicycle? It will be rupees 300, right? Now imagine that given that the person still charges rupees 300 a day, imagine that he suddenly becomes more productive. That is, he starts working faster. And he starts working faster to the extent that he produces 2 bicycles in the day. Now, he has produced 2 bicycles at the end of the day and still charged only rupees 300. What will happen to the cost of each bicycle? Well, the cost will simply be rupees 300 divided by 2. That is 150. So because of a doubling of his speed or his productivity, the cost per bicycle has been halved. It has become half. And this simple example illustrates the inverse relationship that exists between costs on the one hand and productivity on the other. In other words, costs are inversely proportional to productivity. As productivity increases, costs fall. As productivity falls, costs rise. Now, my friends, keep these two things firmly in your mind. One, the distinction between fixed and variable costs, and the other, that is the relationship between costs and productivity in general. And when we say productivity, we are really referring to the average or marginal physical product of a particular factor. In this case, we were discussing the productivity of labor, but we could also talk about the productivity of capital, the productivity of land, or any other factor. Now let's try to focus on the short run for the time being. As I just mentioned, in the short run, some costs are likely to be fixed and some costs are going to be variable. Remember earlier we defined the short run as a situation in which at least one factor was fixed. That is, the quantity of one factor was fixed. So if it was land and labor in the example of wheat production, if you remember, then land was taken as fixed, whereas labor was taken as variable. So if land is fixed, then any costs relating to the land, that is the rental value of the land or the costs of maintaining the land, are likely to be fixed in the short run. So as I mentioned earlier, in the short run, some of the costs will be fixed and some of the costs will be variable. Now, what implication does this have for total costs that a firm incurs in the short run? Let's look at it through a slide. Now, as you might have already guessed, the total cost of production is simply the sum of the total variable costs and the total fixed costs of production. That is, TC is equal to TVC plus TFC. Consider the table and the graph that are being shown. They show the total costs for an imaginary firm of producing different levels of output Q. Let us examine each of these three cost curves in turn. That is the total cost curve, the total variable cost curve, and the total fixed cost curve. Let's first take a look at total fixed costs. Now, as you know, fixed costs do not vary over the period, the short run period that we are considering. Therefore, they will remain constant no matter what level of output is being produced. Therefore, in this case, we have taken fixed costs at a constant of rupees 12. So it is shown by a horizontal line. As you can see on the graph, we have costs on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis. And the fact that TFC is a horizontal line simply captures the fact that there is no change in the total fixed cost as the output changes. Now let's take a look at what total variable cost is. Now when the output is 0, no variable factors will be used. This is obvious. Because variable costs change with the change in the variable factors only, therefore if no factors are employed, the total variable cost will be 0. Thus, when the output produced is 0, the total variable costs will also be 0 because no factors are being employed at that particular moment. That is, no variable factors. Thus, the TVC curve will start from the origin. Now, the shape of the TVC curve follows from the law of diminishing returns. Initially, before diminishing returns set in, TVC rises less and less rapidly as more variable factors are added. For example, in the case of a factory with a fixed supply of machinery, initially as more workers are taken on, the workers can do increasingly specialist tasks and make a fuller use of the capital equipment. This corresponds to the total curve till point M, which is the point of inflection. Remember that the point of inflection is a point which is a turning point in the curve but is not a maximum or minimum. This point for the total variable cost curve occurs at point M, which happens at a level of output of 3. Now, as output is increased beyond point M, diminishing returns set in or come into play. Given that extra workers, that is the extra variable factors, are producing less and less extra output, the extra units of output that they do produce will be costing more and more in terms of wage costs. Thus, TVC rises more and more rapidly. The TVC curve gets steeper. This corresponds to that part of the TVC curve which comes after the point M. Now let's take a look at what happens to total cost. As you can see, total cost is simply the total variable costs plus the total fixed costs. That is, the total cost curve is simply the vertical summation of the total fixed cost curve and the total variable cost curve. And that is obtained as shown in the diagram. We simply shift the TVC curve up by rupees 12, which in this case was taken as the fixed cost. Now, all this information is also summarized in the table here. As you can see, total fixed cost is constant at rupees 12. Total variable cost rises from 0 to 10 to 16 to 21 to 91 as the level of output increases from 0 to 7. Then you have total cost, which is a summation of the two columns, that is of TFC and TVC. So the first row has 12, which is a sum of 12 plus 0. Then you have 22, which is a sum of 12 plus 10. Then you have 28, which is a sum of 12 plus 16, and so on. So, my friends, we've just learned how to draw the total cost, the total variable cost, and the total fixed cost curves for a typical firm. We saw that the total fixed cost curve is a straight line, that the total variable cost and the total cost curves are upward sloping curves. Now, these were total costs. But firms are sometimes also interested, and sometimes actually more interested, in average costs, not total costs. So we need to understand, one, why firms are interested in average costs, and given that they are, how can we derive average cost curves from total cost information? Now, first of all, let's try to understand why average costs might be important for any particular firm. A simple reason is that firms want to have an idea of what it costs on average to produce 1 unit of output. And the reason for that is that they have to set one price for all the units of output. So maybe the first unit of output costs them a lot of money, and the 50th unit does not cost them a lot of money, and the 100th unit virtually comes free. But when they are actually charging a price for their product, they'll have to charge the same price for all those different units. And in order to come up with that price, they need to know what the average cost is. Then, as a result also, they also want to understand how that average cost is broken down between average variable cost and average fixed cost. Now let's see through an example how we can derive the average cost curves for a typical firm. Now the average fixed costs, the average variable costs, and average cost formulas are very simple. These are basically obtained by dividing the total costs by the level of output or the number of units of output produced. So if you look at this table, the average fixed cost is simply obtained by dividing the total fixed cost by the units of output produced. So you have 0 to start with, obviously. Then you have 12 divided by 1, which gives you 12. 12 divided by 2, which gives you 6. 12 divided by 3, which gives you 4, and so on. Similarly, the average variable cost is obtained by dividing the total variable cost by the output Q. Therefore, you start from 0 and then you have 10 divided by 1, which gives you 10. You have 16 divided by 2, which gives you 8. You have 21 divided by 3, which gives you 7, and so on. Now, the average cost or the average total cost can simply be obtained by either adding the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. So you can obtain the average cost figures by adding 12 plus 10 equals 22, 6 plus 8 equals 14, 4 plus 7 equals 11, and so on. Or you could simply divide the total cost figures by the level of output, and you will get the same answer. That is, you divide 22 by 1 to get 22, you divide 28 by 2 to get 14, you divide 33 by 3 to get 11. Now let's try to plot the figures that we've obtained on a graph. What do we see? We see that the average fixed cost curve is a downward sloping line, similar to the isoquants and indifference curves that we've been drawing. It's quite steep to start with, but then it falls rapidly, and then its slope tapers off, that is, becomes very shallow, that is, becomes flatter as the output level is increased. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this is simply that we are dividing a fixed quantity, that is the total fixed cost of 12 in the case, by an increasing number of output. So that is 12 is being divided by 1 and then divided by 2, and therefore the level of average fixed cost is falling as the output increases. On the other hand, if you look at the average variable cost, it first falls and then rises. The turning point in this curve, as you can see, is at point 3, which corresponds with the point M that we identified in the total variable cost curve. That was the point of inflection. Here, that point of inflection becomes the turning point or the minima for the average variable cost curve. The average cost curve is simply the vertical summation of the average variable cost curve and the average fixed cost curve. Now notice the relationship between the average cost curve and the average variable cost curve. As you can see, initially the average cost curve falls much more sharply than the average variable cost curve. What is the reason for this? The reason for this is simply that the average cost curve is a summation of two curves, that is both the average variable cost and the average fixed cost. And since both of these are falling, the effect of two falling curves is greater than the effect of one falling curve. Therefore, the average cost curve falls much more sharply and rapidly than the average variable cost. On the other hand, when you have the turning point and the part of the average cost curve beyond the turning point, you can see that the gap between the average cost curve and the average variable cost curve is narrowing. That is, after the turning point, the average variable cost becomes steeper, but the average cost curve does not become as steep as the average variable cost. And the reason for this is that the average cost is again the sum of the AVC and the AFC. And since in this case the AVC is rising, but the AFC is falling, the increase in AC is not as sharp as the increase in AVC pure. Now, having developed an understanding of total costs and average costs, we come to the third important way in which costs are seen, and that is in its marginal sense. Costs in their marginal sense. Marginal costs are very important in economics. What are marginal costs? You already know. Marginal cost is simply the change in the total cost divided by a change in the quantity. That is the addition to total cost of producing an extra unit of output. So let's say if your total cost is 100 and you have produced 20 units of output. If producing the 21st unit of output takes your total cost to 120, then the marginal cost of the 21st unit is 120 minus 100, which is equal to 20. Now, what in your opinion or in your view would be the shape of the marginal cost curve? Think about it. Recall the relationship that I mentioned earlier between productivity and costs. And note that the relationship is similar for marginal productivity and marginal costs. So think of what happens to marginal physical product as more and more of a quantity is produced and more of a particular factor is used. And then think of what would happen to marginal cost. Now, if you remember, as more and more of a factor is used, as more labor is used, and because we are in the short run here, we assume that capital is fixed. As more and more labor is used, we noted that the marginal physical product of labor first increased and then fell. And this was consistent with the law of diminishing marginal returns. Now, that same law translates into a U-shaped marginal cost curve. That is, as the first few units are produced, the marginal cost falls, reflecting the gains in marginal physical productivity. However, after a certain point, diminishing returns set in, and the downward trend in productivity causes an upward trend in marginal costs. And therefore, the marginal cost curve, when drawn in cost and output space, is a U-shaped or a saucer-shaped curve. Now, let's look at how a comprehensive derivation of these costs can be done and these cost curves can be done through output data that might be given to us of a particular firm. Let's go to our slide. Let us take a simple production function and see how the average and marginal cost curves may be derived from it. Assume that a firm uses just two factors, capital and labor. And let's say this is a UK firm. That is, its costs are denominated in pound sterling. Assume that capital is fixed in supply at 5 units. And as you can see in column 1, the capital value does not change. It stays at 5, 5, 5, 5 throughout. And let's also assume that capital costs £60 per unit per week. Thus, total fixed costs would be £300, which are shown in column 4. Labor is the variable factor as shown in column 2. The effects on output, that is, total physical product, of employing different amounts of labor are shown in column 3. Column 3A and column 3B give respectively the marginal physical product of labor and the average physical product of labor. And they follow the standard law of diminishing marginal returns. So as you can see, marginal physical product of labor first rises from 100 to 150 to 150 and then falls to 100 to 60. Similarly, the average physical product rises from 100 to 125 to 133 and then falls to 125 and 112. It is assumed that workers are paid a wage rate of £100 per week. Thus, total weekly variable costs are simply the number of workers employed multiplied by this wage rate, that is, column 5 is equal to columns 2 multiplied by £100. Therefore, total costs are the sum of total fixed and total variable costs, that is, TC is equal to column 4 plus column 5. To find the average fixed costs and the average variable costs, we can divide the appropriate total cost column by output, that is column 3. Thus, average fixed cost is equal to TFC by TPP is equal to column 4 divided by column 3. Average variable cost is equal to TVC divided by TPP is equal to column 5 by column 3. And now the average cost can be found by dividing TC by TPP, that is column 6 by column 3. Alternatively, average cost can also be found by adding AFC and AVC, as we saw earlier. Marginal costs, on the other hand, can be found by using the formula MC is equal to delta TC divided by delta TPP. In other words, it is the extra cost of producing one more unit of output. Thus, when the firm employs a fifth worker, its costs have gone up by £100. Its output, on the other hand, has increased by 60 units. Thus, if it is costing the firm an extra £100 to produce an extra 60 units, it is costing it £1.67 to produce that one additional unit, and this £1.67 becomes the marginal cost. Let's now draw the average and marginal costs on a graph. As you can see, the average cost curve first falls and then rises. The marginal cost curve also falls and then rises, but intersects the average cost curve at its bottommost point, that is, when 500 units of output are produced. And this is the point when both average and marginal costs are 1.4 rupees or 1.4 pounds, since we are dealing with the UK firm. Now, why is this happening? Why is the marginal cost curve intersecting the average cost curve from the bottom at its minimum point or turning point? This can be illustrated by drawing the APP and MPP graphs as we've done here. Now, if we have labor on the horizontal axis and APP and MPP on the vertical axis, we can see that the MPP curve intersects the APP curve from the top at the APP's maximum point, that is when APP is 133, and this happens when labor is 3 units. Since the marginal costs and average costs are merely a reflection of the marginal physical product and average physical product of labor in this case, we can understand why the marginal cost curve now intersects the average cost from the bottom at its minimum point. If you think about it logically, if the marginal cost is less than the average cost, that is, each additional unit costs less than the previous one, then this will pull the average cost curve down. That is, it will pull the average cost down. However, once the marginal cost is equal to the average cost, there will be no change in the average cost. And this is the turning point in the average cost curve. Then, when the marginal cost becomes higher than the average cost, it pulls the average cost curve up. This is exactly the same but opposite intuition of what happens with marginal physical productivity and average physical productivity. Now, we've completed our discussion of marginal, average, and total costs in the context of the short run. And we've also seen how one can understand the relationship between marginal costs and average costs in the context of the relationship between marginal physical product and average physical product. Now, that was the short run. What happens in the long run? Do we have similar concepts in the long run as well? Well, yes, we do have some of these concepts in the long run. Certainly, we have total costs, we have average costs, we have marginal costs. These concepts will also apply in the long run. What we do not have is, however, fixed costs, because everything can change in the long run. I gave the example of a foreman, that your foreman is one person and that he will remain there, whether the plant operates or whether the plant produces any goods or not. However, think of what happens in the long run. In the long run, it is possible to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 20 factories. And then each of those factories will have its own foreman, right? And therefore, the cost of the foreman does not remain a fixed cost. It becomes a variable cost. Now, the second point to note is that because we are now in the long run, the law of diminishing returns does not apply, or not as strictly as it did in the short run, because now we can change both or all of the factors of production. Earlier, remember, we had capital or land as fixed, and we were increasing or decreasing labor. Now, labor, land, capital, all of these variables, all of these factors are variable. They are not fixed. And therefore, we need to talk about scale, returns to scale. And remember, we introduced three different possibilities: increasing returns to scale, decreasing returns to scale, and constant returns to scale. The equivalent terms in cost terms or in cost language are economies of scale, diseconomies of scale, and constant costs, constant average costs. Let's illustrate these through the use of some graphs. Now, let's look at these three graphs that we have here. Each of these graphs corresponds to a particular feature of the production process. That is, in the first case, we have economies of scale. In the second case, we have diseconomies of scale. And in the third case, we have constant costs. And note that we are talking primarily here about long-run average costs. We will come to total and marginal costs in a while. Now, what happens in the case of economies of scale? This relates to the case when you have increasing returns to scale. That is, if the factors are increased, let's say, by 50%, then output increases by more than 50%. Now, in this case, the long-run average cost curve falls, right? And this is exactly how you define economies of scale. That is, as the scale of production increases, you get economies on your cost. You economize on your cost. That is, your costs become less. How would you draw the long-run total cost curve in this case? Well, the long-run total cost curve would be drawn as an upward sloping line. Note that total costs can never fall, right? As you produce more and more goods, your total costs are likely to increase. However, to deliver economies of scale, that is to deliver a downward sloping long-run average cost, the long-run total cost curve will be an upward sloping line or curve, but with a falling slope. That is, it will become more and more flat as we move to the right or as the output increases. Let's now look at the case for diseconomies of scale. Here the long-run average cost increases, and this is intuitively clear as well. When increasing the size of production is not helping you in terms of cutting your costs, your long-run average costs are likely or expected to increase. How would you draw the long-run total cost curve? The long-run total cost curve would be drawn again as an upward sloping line or an upward sloping curve with an increasing slope, so that each additional unit costs more and more than the previous unit. And this explains why the long-run average cost curve is moving upwards or is an upward sloping curve. Let's now look at the third and final case, where we have constant costs. Here the long-run average cost line is a straight line, and the long-run total cost line would have to be a straight line as well, but it would be a positively sloped straight line. Why should it be a positively sloped straight line and not a curve? Because whenever you divide any point on the long-run total cost by the corresponding point of the output, then you get a constant. That is, the slope of this line has to be constant in order to deliver the long-run average cost as a straight line. Now note that these three different cases, that is that of economies of scale, constant costs, and diseconomies of scale, do not refer to necessarily three different firms. That is, one firm has economies of scale, the other firm has diseconomies of scale, and the third firm has constant costs. That could be the case. But more generally, we think of these three curves or these three situations as occurring in the history of the same firm. So, for example, when a firm is small, it experiences economies of scale. That is, as it increases its output, its productivity or its employment of resources becomes more and more efficient, and therefore it experiences falling average costs. So this would be consistent with a falling long run average cost. However, as it reaches a certain point, then it experiences constant returns to scale or constant costs, and therefore the average cost curve flattens out. So for the first few units of output, it has a downward sloping average cost curve. Then it becomes flat or horizontal, and then eventually, as it increases its production more and more, it runs into decreasing or diminishing returns, and therefore the costs of production, the long run average costs of production increase. Often this happens because of the organizational problems of very large enterprises. When enterprises or firms become very large, the administrative or organizational aspects or problems become huge, and they also add to the costs of the firm and the long run average cost at which any additional or any output unit is produced. Now, in our derivation of the long run average costs, we are actually making three important assumptions, and you need to understand what these assumptions are. The first assumption is that we are taking the price of factors as given or fixed. So we are taking the price of wages, the price of labor as fixed, so that wages are considered as constant. The price of land or the rental value of land is taken as constant. Now imagine what would happen if the minimum wage rate changed in the economy. If the government said that minimum wages are going to be so much, and therefore laborers need to be paid higher than what they are being paid right now. How would this impact the long run average cost curve? Think about it. It would simply raise or shift the long run average cost curve upwards. So if the long run average cost curve is like this, it will move upwards like this. If it is like this, it will move upwards like this. What happens, however, at different levels of output is another matter. So for example, it might be possible for the same firm to negotiate different factor prices at different levels of output. So think of what happens to raw material costs or raw material prices when a firm is small compared to when it is big. When the firm is big, it can negotiate quantity or bulk discounts with suppliers of the raw material, and therefore its cost of the factor might fall as it becomes bigger and bigger. And this is what is captured in the slope of the long run average cost. This is different from a change in the price of the factor at any given level of output or at any level of output. That causes a shift in the long run average cost curve, whereas the increased bargaining power or the increased efficiency that the firm realizes due to an increase in its size is captured by the slope of the average cost curve. The second assumption that we are making in deriving the long run average cost is that we are taking technology as fixed. We are not assuming that technology or the way in which the production process happens or is conceptualized and executed changes. Thus, if a firm experiences economies of scale, it is not because the technology has somehow improved. No, it is because it has used or it has become able to use the existing technology more efficiently. It has been able to use the existing resources more efficiently. This is another important assumption. The third and final assumption relates to the combination of inputs that are used in order to produce a level of output. We noted in our analysis of short-run production theory that the optimal point or the optimal combination of inputs is reached when the marginal physical product divided by the price of that particular factor is equal for all factors. So MPPL over PL is equal to MPPK over PK and so on. And we noted that this assumption was also met in our isoquant analysis. That is when the isocost curve became tangential to the isoquant, the ratio of the prices was equal to the ratio of the marginal physical products, and they delivered the same equi-marginal principle. So the derivation of the long-run average cost assumes that the firm chooses that combination of inputs at which the marginal physical product derived from the last dollar spent on each input are equal. That is, for labor, for capital, for land, for all these factors. These are the three important assumptions that we make in deriving the long-run average cost curve. Now, my friends, we have two main concepts still to tackle in this particular lecture. One relates to long-run marginal cost, and the other relates to the relationship between long-run average costs and short-run average costs. Let's start by understanding what happens to the long-run marginal cost as the output of a firm increases. Let's illustrate this through the use of a few graphs. Let's go to a slide. Now here we have four diagrams. If there are economies of scale, that is diagram A, additional units of output will add less to costs than the average. Therefore, the long-run marginal cost curve must be below the long-run average cost curve, and thus pulling the average cost curve down as output increases. This follows from standard short-run cost theory. That is, if the marginal cost is below the average cost must be falling. If there are diseconomies of scale, that is diagram B, every additional unit of output will cost more than the average cost. Therefore, the long-run marginal cost curve must be above the long-run average cost curve, and therefore pulling it upwards. If there are no economies or diseconomies of scale, so that the long-run average cost curve is horizontal, any additional units of output will cost the same as the average, and thus leave the average cost unaffected. And this is captured in diagram C. You can hopefully now better understand, through the understanding of marginal cost curve and how they are drawn, why we drew the long-run total cost curve the way we did in a previous slide. Finally, let's look at diagram D, where the typical case is shown of initial economies of scale and then of diseconomies of scale. For the portion that the long-run margin cost curve is below the long-run average cost, the long-run average cost is falling. For that part of the graph where the long-run marginal cost curve is above the long-run average cost curve, the long-run average cost curve is rising. And note also that the LRMC intersects the LRAC at the latter's minimum point. That is, it cuts the LRAC at its minima. So my friends, let's talk about the last part of today's lecture. That is, relationship between long-run and short-run average cost curves. Unfortunately, time will not permit us to talk in detail about this relationship. So we'll have to carry it forward to the next lecture. At the outset, however, let me say that the long-run average cost curve is nothing but a combination of the short-run average cost curves. So it comes from logic as well. The short run, when combined together, so many short runs combine together to form the long run, and therefore many short run average cost curves logically combine to generate the long run average cost curve. Now let's try to sum up on what we've learned today. We started with a discussion of how economists looked at costs. We gave examples of sunk cost, opportunity costs. We saw what total costs were, average costs were, why firms might be interested in average costs. That is in the context of price setting. Then we developed the concept of marginal costs. We also saw what the relationship between marginal cost and average costs were. And we discussed this relationship in the context of marginal physical product and average physical product. Then we looked at long run costs, and we saw that there were no fixed costs in the long run because all the variable were, or all the factors were variable. They could be changed. We saw how long run average cost curves would change with different circumstances. That is, when you had economies of scale, diseconomies of scale, and constant costs. We also saw the assumptions that we made in deriving long-run average cost curves. Finally, we looked at long-run marginal cost curves and how they would intersect the long-run average cost curves in a typical case of initial economies of scale and then diseconomies of scale. So, my friends, that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Inshallah, in our next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between long-run and short-run average costs. But more importantly, we'll go on to discuss revenue and then profits and see how a firm would try to maximize profits, that is the difference between revenues and costs. So till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.